Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our worship service, those who are here in person and online as well. Our scripture reading today is from Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to read verses 13 to 16. So Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 to 16. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on the earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking about the country they had left, they would have an opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Trust is built on relationships. Now, when I was around 18 or 20 years old, I can't remember, but I was pretty young. I had my first car. I drove all the way from St. Albert to Movies 12 on 99th Street. I don't know if you remember that place. I think it's been torn down by now. And was going to meet a friend, so I bought a ticket and I waited outside. This is right around the times, when I was 20, I would have been 1993, I guess. So right around that time when cell phones were kind of new, but I was too poor to ever own one. I don't think I got one until I was 30 or something. So didn't have a phone or anything, but I bought my ticket and I was waiting for my buddy. He stood me up. Never showed up. When the movie started, I actually went to a payphone. I must have had his phone number on a piece of paper because nothing's electronic back then. I gave him a call, no answer, no response, nothing. And he wasn't there, didn't show up. So I got kind of mad. I'm mad enough that I just went home. I didn't go see the movie or anything. I just kind of wasted the ticket. Kind of ticked off. And it never occurred to me at that time that someone would actually not show up with any sort of a word otherwise. It's different where if you make plans with somebody and then, even a couple of days or even minutes or hours before, they call and let you know, oh yeah, I can't make it for whatever reason, that's fine. But just to not say anything and not show up, it really kind of shook my trust in that person. And really shook my trust in people in general. Again, I was kind of young and impressionable, so I started thinking that, is that the way everybody is? Is everybody like that, where if you make plans and they don't show up, that's kind of a normal thing? I found out later it was just kind of an innocent thing. They just forgot. It was just one of those things. I know since I've been living my life since then, I forgot about things too, so it's kind of understandable. All is forgiven, not a big deal that way. But it did kind of develop a bit of a lack of trust in people in general and me. I was kind of trusting up to that point. And then after that point, I had a little bit of a skepticism, when I was making plans with people. Trust is something that's earned, something that is earned in our relationships that we have with people. You might have some friends that can be trusted. You base things on their word and you make plans and you know that they're going to come through. And maybe you have people that maybe they're friends as well, that are not trustworthy, that you kind of take those things with a grain of salt. You kind of understand that if they say yes, that's kind of a maybe. You're not really sure if it's going to happen or not. In the book of Hebrews, as we've been going through, we get into chapter 11, and we're getting into this topic of faith. Faith and trust are very similar, if not the same thing, in certain situations. And the author of Hebrews is talking about somebody who we can trust to the end, and that is God. That trust is based on this relationship that we have with God. And we see that he is never going to let us down. He's never going to forget, like we might at some times. So we can have that trust that embraces his promises that he makes to us. We saw in the first 7 verses of this chapter last lesson, we saw how faith was explained as a confidence for things hoped for and a conviction of things not seen. We have that trust that these things that we haven't experienced yet are going to happen. We have that faith and belief in him and that trust. We saw Abel, Noah, and Enoch, and how they acted on their faith by worshiping God, by walking with God, by working with God. Their faith was shown in their lives. It was reflected in their actions because of this belief that they had in God and his promises and the things that he says. And this faith is described as something that we need if we do want to please God. If we want to make him happy with us, if we want to be obedient to him, we have to have this faith. And that faith is going to be reflected in our actions as well. They go hand in hand. We can't have just belief and no actions, and we can't just have empty actions with no faith or belief behind that. That has to be the motivation behind that. If you go to Hebrews chapter 4, another aspect of our faith, which we're going to look at today, pertains to the promises in which we hope. In Hebrews 4 and verse 1, we're warned. There's a warning in this passage. Hebrews 4 and verse 1. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you is found to have fallen short of it. We are warned here to not fall short of what was promised. He has offered it to us, but we need that faith and obedience to accept that gift, to make sure that we don't fall short, and he's warning us to not fall short of that. You go ahead to a couple of chapters, to Hebrews chapter 6. Look at verses 11 and 12 of Hebrews chapter 6. So Hebrews 6, starting in verse 11. We want each of you to show the same diligence to the very end, so that what you hope for may be fully realized. We do not want you to become lazy, but to imitate those who through faith and patience inherit what has been promised. So again, in this passage, it shows us that faith, along with patience, is necessary to inherit the promises. We have to have this faith. And this faith is a faith that pleases God, and one that pleases God is one that embraces his promises. We believe what he's telling us. We have a trust in him, and that trust is, again, based not just on closing our eyes and kind of taking a leap in the dark. It's based on our relationship that we have with him through studying the word, through seeing the things that are true and the things that are proven to us. And again, like the friend that we have that's trustworthy, that trust was built on our relationship with them. We have past experiences with them. We see that they're trustworthy, that they follow through on their word. We have that same relationship with God. We see that he follows through on his word. We see the things that are laid out in Scripture to show that what he's telling us is true. We can check those things so that the things that we have not seen yet, like the promise of heaven, we can trust in that. We can believe because he is trustworthy. So, the faith that pleases God is one that embraces his promises. And we're going to look at verses 8 to 22 in Hebrews chapter 11 today. And we're going to look at the examples. Though we just read in Hebrews 6, verse 12, it says, we do not want you to become lazy, but to imitate those who through faith and patience inherit that which is promised. We're going to look at some examples in verses 8 to 22 of chapter 11 of people who did base their life on the promises of God. Some of the Old Testament people that are listed in the account of the Old Testament, and see how their faith was shown in their lives. See how they based their life on the promises. They embraced the promises of God through their actions. And in verse 16 of Hebrews chapter 11, if you go there, this is a very encouraging verse. Verse 16, in this passage, it shows because of their faith, God is not ashamed to be called their God. What an amazing thing for him to say about us, for God to say, I'm not ashamed for you to call me your God. It's something that we should be trying to do as well, to have that same faith that these people in the Old Testament had, so that God is not ashamed to be called our God as well. So do we have this sort of faith that makes God unashamed to be called our God? So we're going to answer this question. We're going to go through verses 8 to 22. We're going to review the studies that are shown in this passage and look at the examples provided in the Old Testament of faith that embraces these promises of God. So we're going to start with the faith of these patriarchs, these characters in the Old Testament, these people in the Old Testament. We're going to look at Hebrews chapter 11. We'll start in verse 8. We'll look at the faith of Abraham to start. So Hebrews 11 and verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. So we can see in this passage that Abraham had a faith and he embraced the promises of God and he obeyed because of this faith. It was reflected in his actions. When God called him to leave his country, he obeyed the voice of the Lord. He obeyed what he was told to do. Even though at first he didn't know where he was going. God just said leave and he's like, okay, I'm just going to leave. But he wasn't sure of a destination. This is an example of conviction in things not seen. Abraham had no idea kind of what was going to happen in the future, but he still acted on that promise that God made to him. You go to Luke chapter 6. Again, like always, keep a bookmark in Hebrews 11. We're coming back there for sure. If you go to Luke chapter 6, we can see here in Abraham's example that faith and obedience are not contradictory terms. They are things that go hand in hand. And we can ask ourselves, is our faith an obedient faith like the faith of Abraham? Luke chapter 6, and we'll look at verse 46. So Luke 6 and verse 46. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? In a very simple verse, and there's many like this in the New Testament, showing how we are to have that belief in God and Jesus, and we are also to have that obedience as well. Faith and obedience go hand in hand. We must have that belief, and we must have our actions in our lives that reflect that belief. The belief is the motivation for us to have those actions to do what God and Jesus want us to do. We are to call him Lord, Lord. We are to have that belief, and that belief is to be reflected in our actions. This is the same way in which Abraham acted on the promise made to him. We must be obedient as well for the promises that God has made to us. Back to Hebrews 11. Look at verses 9 and 10. We're still looking at Abraham here. And this is one where it's interesting about how he lived his life in a temporary manner. I'm going to read my version from the New International Version, and your version might have a word called sojourned in there, depending if it's older or not. Hebrews 11, verses 9 and 10. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So if your version says sojourn in there, sojourn means to live somewhere temporarily. If you're sojourning, you're staying in some place, but it's temporary. If you're going on vacation and you're staying in a hotel, you're sojourning in that city. You're sojourning in this hotel. And Abraham made his home in the land of Canaan, but he did it temporarily. God said, go, leave your house, go to where I promise you. Eventually he found out that he was going to Canaan. He stayed there, and he knew that it was required by faith for him to live there like a stranger in a foreign country. Even though it was the land of promise, Abraham's descendants were not going to have it for another 400 years. God was promising it to them, but he was living there temporarily. They actually left, and then they came back again, and then they actually got the land of Canaan. He waited patiently for the city whose builder and maker is God. So this really suggests that the promises that Abraham embraced were more than those just pertaining to the land of Canaan. He knew that the Israelite nation, his descendants, were going to receive a nation, were going to receive land physically in a physical sense. But he also had a heavenly hope as well. He had this hope in the thing that was going to come in the future, which is the same thing that we look forward to as well. If you go to 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11, we apply this same idea to us, this idea of living temporarily in a place. We too are sojourners and pilgrims. Again, depending on your version, it might have those words. Again, in my version, it was living like a stranger in a foreign country. We are to live in the same manner, to live a life of faith in a similar way. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. So again, my version is referring to us as foreigners and exiles. Yours might be sojourners and pilgrims. People are passing through. People are just staying temporarily. We are here on this earth for a time, but our promised inheritance is in heaven. That's what God has promised us. And we have to live our lives knowing that we will receive this heavenly promise. If you think that this life is all that there is, and you're a permanent resident here, you're going to live your life differently than somebody who knows that it's a temporary thing, and you're going to base your life on things that earn your way into heaven, the way to earn and be obedient to God so he can give you that gift of heaven. Is our faith a sojourning faith like Abraham's? Is it something that we know that we are going to receive a better promise from God, and we live our lives in a way that reflects that? We go back to Hebrews 11. We're going to continue on with Abraham. We'll look at verses 17 to 19. So jump down a little bit to verse 17. This is again Abraham's faith reflected in his actions. Hebrews 11, 17 to 19. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So we're going to go to the Old Testament here and see the passage that shows this account, this event. If you go to Genesis 22, by faith, Abraham offered up his son Isaac. Genesis 22 and verse 2. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." So Abraham's faith required him to be willing to offer that which was closest to him, his son Isaac. I can't imagine that whatsoever. But we read in an account that this is the type of faith that Abraham had. He was willing to do this. I like back in the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews 11, we have some insight into Abraham's thought process. Again, back in Hebrews 11, Abraham in verse 19, it says, "Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death." Abraham assumed that God would raise Isaac back up from the dead. He had the faith, and he understood that God was going to work things out in the situation. It's something where God promised Abraham that he would have seed that, descendants that numbered more than the sand on the seashore. He was going to have all of this offspring, and it was going to be through Isaac. That was his only son. And now God's telling him, okay, sacrifice your son. So it was kind of contradictory to Abraham. It would be something that he wouldn't necessarily understand or really get it. But he did have that thought process. He said, God's going to work things out. He had that faith and trust and belief in God that things were going to work out for the best in this situation. And he illustrated that confidence in things hoped for. He assumed God would raise Isaac from the dead if he sacrificed him. As you read on in Genesis, you'll see that God stopped Abraham from sacrificing Isaac. It was simply a test to see if he had that faith. And he did. But it was something where Abraham acted upon his faith, these promises that God had made to him. If you go to Luke chapter 14, if we apply the same concept to us, our faith often requires us to give up some things that are closest to us. Luke chapter 14, verses 26 and 27. There's a couple of verses out of a whole passage that really talks about counting the cost of being a Christian. Understanding what you are promising and what kind of life you are getting yourself into when you become a Christian, and some of the things that you might be required to do. Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son Isaac, to give up something very close to him. Other things in his life, we saw how he moved away. He did all these things in his life that were sacrifices for him. And we also are required to sacrifice things at time, or at least be willing to do this. Luke chapter 14, verses 26 and 27. "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." Our faith may require us to give up some things that are closest to us. In this passage, we know this word hate has the emphasis of being loved less. But that idea of hating really drives home that point that God and our obedience to him and our faith in him has to be the number one thing in our life. As we read through the New Testament, we can see that we are to support our families, we're to love other people, we are to do those things. The emphasis in this passage is to really show that God is number one. If it does come down to it, and I've heard stories of people and some of their family members in some of their family situations where they essentially become disowned because of their Christianity. And that is required at times. That's something that is necessary. We have to have our faith in God and our faith in the promises that he makes to us, that things are going to work out for the best. We are going to receive that eternal inheritance, even though we might have to give up things that are very close to us, including our own lives and including our family as well, if it does come down to that. Is our faith and offering faith the same as Abraham's? We go back to Hebrews 11. We move on to our next person in this account is Sarah, Abraham's wife. Keep wanting to say Abraham's 11. Hebrews 11, verses 11 and 12. Hebrews 11, verses 11 and 12. "And by faith, even Sarah, who is past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he was as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as sand on the seashore. I mean, you might be old, but I don't know if you'd be considered as good as dead. That's got to be pretty old. But Sarah was past the normal age of childbearing. Again, if we go back to Genesis, let's look at chapter 18. We'll look at the account listed in the book of Genesis about this situation, about what happened here. Genesis 18, verses 10 to 12. So Genesis 18, starting in verse 10. Then one of them said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure? So Sarah, we can see in this passage, was at least skeptical. She's like, yeah, right, kind of laughing to herself. Give me a break. There's no way I'm going to have a kid. But although she laughed when she first heard of God's promise, we saw in Hebrews that she considered him faithful who had made the promise. She believed in it afterwards. That was her initial reaction, but she came around. She understood that she could trust in this promise that God made to her. If you go ahead to Genesis 21, we'll see the outcome of this. Genesis 21, we'll look at verses 1 to 3. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. So she trusted that God would fulfill his promise, and he did. And now we have this account that we can see that can help us build our relationship with God so that we can understand and trust in God as well when he promises us things. He came through with a miraculous act, essentially, where she was well past the age of childbearing and she still got a child. So through her faith, the promises of this great nation were fulfilled. If we go back to Hebrews, we'll look at chapter 4 and verse 16. Our faith requires looking to God for strength and trusting that he will provide. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. We must look to God with confidence. Sarah, she was skeptical at first, but then she had confidence. She understood that God would come through on his promise, and he did. We have to have that same confidence. We must know in our hearts that God can help us in anything that he wants to help us with. And we will receive what is promised, most especially we'll receive that promised inheritance of being in heaven with him. So we need to have that same receiving faith like Sarah, that same faith that is going to be resulted in the actions that we do, because we know that he's going to come through for us. We go back to Hebrews 11. We're going to have 3 short verses of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. These are all the descendants of Abraham and Sarah. We already know from the previous verse that Isaac was the son of Abraham and Sarah. And then Jacob and Joseph were down the line as well. All of those promised descendants that God had promised to Abraham. Hebrews 11 and verse 20. Hebrews 11 and verse 20. It says, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. So one short verse about Isaac. But the thing we can see in this passage is that back in the Old Testament, there's an account of Isaac blessing Jacob and Esau, giving them blessings. And what he's doing here is Isaac is willing to bless his sons with the promises made to him as well. God promised him things, and so Isaac was willing to put his word to say that, yes, you guys are going to receive these things as well based on the word of God. So he trusted God enough to say that God is going to come through. And this illustrates how Isaac, by his faith, he embraced those promises as well. He's willing to say that, yeah, God is going to come through. He's willing to say this. He's willing to base his word on God's word as well. We'll see a similar thing in the faith of Jacob. Go to verse 21 of Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. So very similar to his father Isaac, Jacob blessed the sons of Joseph based on the promises made to him by God. God said that this is going to happen, so he did the same thing and said, yeah, you guys, this is what's going to happen as well. He's blessing them based on what God had promised to him. And again, this shows that he embraced the promises of God as well through his actions. He's willing to put his word on the line based on what God had said. We can mimic this faith as well by showing others that we believe in God's promises as well. We can tell people, they say, why are you a Christian? One of your reasons might be because I get to go to heaven. And we know that, we believe that, and we're willing to say that to other people. We're putting our word on the line based on what God had promised to us. We go to verse 22 of Hebrews chapter 11. We'll see the faith of Joseph. Hebrews 11, verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. So when he was dying, Joseph made mention of the departure of Israel out of Egypt. But he was still in Egypt. He wasn't going to see the exodus of the Israelite nation, but he knew it was going to happen. God had promised that this was going to happen. They were going to go to the promised land. They were going to leave Egypt. And since he knew it was going to happen, he made instructions about how his bones were going to be buried. He knew that it was going to happen. And again, he was willing to give them instructions. Okay, when this happens, you guys take care of my burial this way. So in doing so, he demonstrated again that he embraced the promises of God. So these are the examples of the faith of the patriarchs, these Old Testament people that are the account that we read in the Old Testament. If you noticed, we skipped over verses 13 to 16. That was our scripture reading. The reason we did is we're going to look at it now, and we're going to see that what is said in these verses applies to Abraham and Sarah, and also to Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and also us as well. We're going to see how this passage ties in all of these accounts on how we are to embrace the promises of God. So let's look at Hebrews 11. We'll start reading in verse 13. Hebrews 11 and verse 13. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on the earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Here we see that they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. That's how we can see how Abraham, he knew that he was going, or his descendants were going to inherit the land of Canaan, the promised land. But he was also longing for that heavenly country as well. He knew that he was going to inherit that kingdom, the inheritance of going and being in heaven with God. They did not receive the promises during their lifetime. Yet with faith, they could see them far off. They knew that these things were going to happen. And they freely confessed to be strangers and pilgrims on the earth. This is a temporary place for us. We're on our way to a better place. And this implies that they sought a homeland. They looked for their final place. And what they desired was a better one and a heavenly one that's the heavenly country, to be in heaven with God. And they died still living in faith. They were trusting the promises of God. They based their life on this faith that they had. Their actions were reflected because of that faith that they had. And they had that relationship with God that showed that we can trust what he's telling us to be true, and we are going to act on that trust that we have. We keep reading, and we look at the last part of verse 16 of Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11, verse 16. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. God is not ashamed to be called their God. He is well pleased with them. It was their faith in embracing the promises that pleased him. And we have these as examples in the book of Hebrews, and also if you study back in the Old Testament as well, to see how they had their faith in their life, their actions in their life reflected that faith that they had. They embraced the promises that God had promised to them, and they lived their life based on those promises. And because they had this faith, God is not ashamed to be called their God. He's somebody who says, yeah, I'm proud that these people are worshiping me and they're my servants. It's something that really we should be trying to attain as well, to be that faithful servant of God, just like these people were in the Old Testament. If you look at verse 10, it says, for he, this is Abraham, was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. God has prepared a city for them. And they waited for what was prepared. They waited patiently and faithfully. And that faith and patience is something that pleases God. You go to chapter 13 and verse 14. We have the same promise to look forward to as well. Hebrews 13 and verse 14. For here we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. We have the same city to look forward to as well. We have that same heavenly city to look forward to as well as Christians. This is something that we have that belief. We have that knowledge that God is going to come through on his promises. That's going to be reflected in our life, in the obedient life that we live, trying to please him. If you go to 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 13, this goes further into the description of this new heavenly city that we're waiting for. 2 Peter 3 and verse 13. But in keeping with his promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells. The same promise that Abraham and the other patriarchs were looking forward to is the one that we can look forward to as well. The same promise that was made to them way back when they lived is also made to us, and we can look forward to that promise as well. And when we have that faith that embraces this promise, God will not be ashamed to be called our God as well. So what kind of faith pleases God? It's one that's a worshiping faith, like that Abel had. A walking faith, like Enoch had. A working faith, like Noah. We saw that in the first part of chapter 11 last week. And then it also includes a waiting faith that we see in these other patriarchs, in Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. They were willing to wait. They were willing to say that, okay, this might not happen during our lifetime, but it is going to happen eventually. We're still going to base our life on this promise. And this faith is one that pleases God, that embraces this promise made by God. It's going to be reflected in our actions. And as we patiently wait for these ultimate fulfillment of these promises, it may not happen in our lifetime, but we can still base our life on this promise. God is trustworthy. We know that with our relationship with him. And with conviction and confidence of these things hoped for, these things that are not seen, we will obey his calling. We're going to sojourn. We're going to live temporarily on this earth. We're going to know that this is a temporary place. We're going to offer up whatever sacrifice he asks of us. We are going to know that he is the number one thing in our life. And we're going to receive strength to do whatever he needs us to do. We can approach his throne of grace with confidence because we know that he is going to come through on his promises. And he has the power to do that. And we will make mention of his promises from generation to generation. We're going to understand that the things he's promised to us is something that we can put our word on as well. And we can spread that word the same way that Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph did when they were blessing their descendants and making their commitments based on the promises that God had made to them. And this is the kind of faith that God is pleased with, and that is God is and is in those who God is not ashamed to be called their God. I'd like to offer an invitation. If you've not yet accepted this gift, anybody can have this blessing, this promise made to them, where they can inherit going to heaven, having this blessing given to them of having eternal life with him in heaven. We can show you in the scriptures how to accept that. If you have that faith and you have that belief, obedience again is required as well, that we see in the Old Testament and the New Testament too. We can show you in the scriptures how to accept this gift that's offered to all people. And if you are struggling in any way, again, make your needs known, and we'd love to help in any way that we can.